In this video, I'm going to discuss approaching and lighting dramatic portraits like this one. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is Dylan Golby, and welcome to a video on how I approach and light my portraits for my Tattoos of Asia project. Now, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with my Tattoos of Asia project, basically what I've been doing for about the last 5 years in any time off that I've been able to find is traveling all over Asia to try and meet, interview, and photograph as many people as I possibly can who have tattooed their faces for cultural reasons. So I've been sitting down with them, hearing their stories, and making a set of portraits. And so today we're going to go through a little bit about the philosophical and the technical approach to making these portraits. What's inspired me to make this video is that I haven't really been able to, get out into the field and do more of this because of the current situation the world is in. And so what I've been doing is making the first draft of my book. And so basically, this is going to be all the stories and the portraits and everything that I have photographed over the time that I've been working on this project. And it will come together into a final volume. And so basically what that has allowed me to do is sort of look back over my portraits and, remember some of my stories and, sort of think about how I approached it, whether that be technically or philosophically, and what I was trying to achieve. And so last year I was able to make basically my final trip for this project so far, and I do have a video of that, a documentary that was made by my good friend Wesley Cheng. I'll put a link up here and one down below if you'd like to check that out as well. But for today's video, what I want to do is just take a look at these portraits on the black, why it is that I do that, and how it is that I do that. Now, I did make a video about this a couple of years back, but it was possibly not the best presentation and it was a little bit rudimentary. So I want to go back today and go into a little bit more detail, as I do get this question, quite frequently on this channel and also in the various writings that I do whenever I include portraits like these. So let's jump in and we'll first take a look at how I approach them, and then we'll take a look at the technical way that they're executed. In taking these portraits, there were basically three main goals that I had, and the first one was to photograph people as I found them. And so, for example, in this portrait here, this lady is wearing her modern knitted woolen jumper. She's not wearing her traditional garb, which she doesn't wear any time other than festivals anyway. So I wanted to, unless people specifically asked to be photographed like that, I wanted to make sure that I was just, photographing them as they are in the modern world today. The second thing that I wanted to do was to make sure that they all had a unified and slightly modern style to them. So no matter where I was going to be photographing, I'd be able to get a unified look to the images. And the third thing that I wanted to have is to make sure that the tattoos were front and center. This is a project about tattoos, so I wasn't going to be photographing too many extremely wide scenes. It was going to be a lot of close-ups of faces so that we could see the tattoos clearly. The second and third points are the ones that I want to talk about today because they relate also to the technical side of the photography. Now, the first thing being that I wanted a unified and modern look. Now, unified is obvious. That means basically I want all of my portraits to look very similar, like they were shot basically in the same location by the same photographer. And that's easy to, achieve with flash by using, a large modifier like I do and bringing it in nice and close so I get that beautiful soft light across the faces. That gives me a very stylized look, but it also gives it a very modern look. Now, if we consider photography, 50, 60 years ago, lighting was done not so much with large softboxes. It might have been done with a lot harsher sources, multiple sources to soften things up, or it might not have been done at all. It might have just been done in, soft daylight or harsh daylight or with an on-camera flash. And I didn't want to have any of those looks to the images. I wanted to have something that was a little bit, unique in terms of the way these people had been photographed before. The other reason, of course, is that I don't know exactly when I'm going to show up to a village, when I'm going to be able to meet people, when they're going to be able to give me time. And so being able to make a portrait in a rainstorm in Taiwan that looks very, very similar to something that I shot on a sunny day in somebody's house in northeastern India is something that I really wanted to have for this project, and so I chose to work with the flash. I also decided very early on that I wanted to have a completely blacked out background that would allow you to focus wholly on the tattoos. And of course, that's one part of making the tattoos front and center, is making sure that there's nothing to distract you from them. And so when we go into, some of these people's houses and I'm photographing, sometimes, there's a TV in the background, or the wall is made from cement and it's not the most pretty thing, or I meet them in the field and we need to photograph them under a tree. And what I didn't want to be doing, especially when I first started and I was only using speed lights to be able to control my light, is dealing with all these different background types. So I decided that just cancelling out that ambient light and using a flash would allow me to focus really heavily on the tattoos. As time progressed, my sensibilities changed a little bit, and I didn't want things to just be pure black. I didn't want things to be extremely dark with no detail, and so I started photographing them in a slightly different way, just leaving enough detail back there in some cases that I would be able to pull it out later on if I wanted, but also leaving a little bit more detail in the non-lit side of the face so that we could see into that as well. And that's just a case of me growing as a photographer and learning how I like to portray things, and just changing along the way. And thankfully all of this has been photographed in RAW, and a good portion of it has been photographed with GFX cameras. So I've got a lot of dynamic range in those, and even if I thought, I've lit this side of the face and completely blacked out this side, if you actually look in the RAW file, I've been able to pull that back for some of my older photos as well and sort of bring them into the newer style, the newer way of photographing things. And so that's one good reason to shoot in RAW as well. So just to wrap up, the choice of style was to separate my photos from other people who've been to these areas. It was to allow a bit more of a modern feeling to the photos by using, very soft flash light. It was also to create a unified look across different countries and the different times that I'd be making these photos. I also wanted to have very up close and personal portraits so that we could see the tattoos very, very clearly. So let's jump over and see how those were technically executed. First and foremost, the main technique that I employ when making these portraits is to just be a good human being. When I arrive in a village carrying a medium format camera and a softbox and a bag full of gear that people may not have seen before, I've got a couple of other people tagging along to help out. We're going to cause a scene. We might cause a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of worry for people. Who are these people? What are they doing here? What is all this stuff? And so the thing that I always like to do is to try to learn, a couple of words, hello and thank you, in the local language or dialect, and just smile, just be welcoming, open hands. If somebody extends their hand to you, shake it. Maybe don't walk up and hug people, try to observe things that you might do around anybody. Just be a little bit cautious, but be welcoming, be friendly, and just let people know that you're here to do good. And that goes a long way to being able to sit down with people and to photograph them. So when it comes time to actually photograph my subject, I've already spent some time with them. They already know who I am. We've had a little interview. I've learned a little bit about their history and the kind of person they are through their answers. And so when it comes to actually make the photograph, it doesn't take all that long. We're just spending a few minutes and I'm trying to elicit the expression that shows something that I've learned about that person while I've been there. And so I keep my kit very, very simple. I've got one softbox or umbrella, which is usually either the Photex soft lighter or just a generic shoot-through umbrella that I take with me. Keeps the kit fairly small but gives me a nice large soft light source. And so that will typically be off to one side, just like how I'm lighting myself right now. This is a much smaller umbrella, of course, because I've got white walls to bounce things around, which I don't always have in the field. So I'll take that, I'll place it up high and to one side, and then I'll adjust it if needs be. And then from there, it's just a case of making a few photos until I have what I need and not pushing it too far, because you don't want to leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth. For this first example, I want to talk through a portrait from start to finish. Now, this gentleman is a Konyak elder from Nagaland in India, and recently he actually passed away, so may he rest in peace. However, this is one of my favorite portraits, and it will be making its way into my book with his story, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit today. So as you can see, even when I visited him, he was quite an old man, so we didn't want to, move him around too much. We photographed him where we found him, which was sitting by his fire in his house. Now, these houses, if for anyone who's been into a Konyak house, are extremely dark. There's only maybe a door on each side, there's no windows, and they are just pitch black. And so it's very, very easy for me in this case to get a black background if I wanted one. The only light I would really have was my flash. So I started the shoot as I always do by just getting my ambient exposure. Now my ambient exposure in this case, if I was at a 125th of a second, which is the sync speed for the GFX, it really didn't matter. I could be at f2, I could be at f5.6, I could be at f11. I was getting no light. So the only light would be coming from my flash. So I put up my first flash and I started at f8 because I wanted to get an extremely detailed shot that would show off, you know, his face as well as his chest tattoo and his necklace and the fact that he was sitting there holding on to his walking stick. So f8 would get me enough depth of field to be able to show all of that, and it would also be well within the realms of the power that I could put with an 8200, which, you know, at this distance when I'm in really close, the flash is, you know, no more than half a meter away from him, I'm going to be working at probably something like an 1/8 or a 1/16 power to be able to get enough to shoot at f8, so that wasn't really an issue. Of course, the room was extremely dark, but I did want to make sure that that background would stay black and that my flash wouldn't really be, you know, lighting up any of the spoons or pots or pans or anything like that that was hanging from the walls, or wouldn't be bringing in any detail from those wooden walls. I didn't really want that for this portrait, so I made sure to put the black background behind him as well. And the other thing that I did get, because I didn't have any ambient light filling in one side of his face, is I got a very dark, you know, if we're looking at me right now, get a very dark edge to this side of his face. And so what I decided to do was take another flash out. Now, I had a little flash with me, which is a Godox, I think it's called a TT350, runs on 2 AA batteries, nowhere near as much power as an 8200, but in a pinch, if my 8200 died, I would be able to get by, you know, making shots in dark areas like this with that flash. So what I decided to do with it in this case was actually put it behind him on this side and just have it like this, light up the side of him, give him a little bit of a rim light. Now, I'll switch that off, it's a little bit bright, but what I wanted to be able to do was just have him separated from that background, and ideally I would have had another umbrella with me and been able to soften that light, so it was just sort of a nice soft wash over the side of his face, but I didn't have that, and so I decided to go with it being quite harsh like that. The other thing that I could have done, thinking back about it now, is actually picked up something like one of the woven bamboo sheets that they used to sort rice there, and fired my flash into that and allowed that to come back onto his face. That would have given it a nice warm color to the light, as well as softening it up a little bit. But in the heat of the moment and working with this gentleman at the time, I didn't think of it, and so what we have is a bit of a harsh rim light around the side, but still I feel like it helps to separate him from the background. The next thing that I wanted to do was get my up-close and personal portrait of his facial tattoo, and since I was using the GFX and the GF 110mm f2, which you can see my review about, or my rave about up here, I'll put a little link for you, but basically it has a very special rendering wide open, so I took the lens all the way out to f2 and reduced my flashes by 4 stops. So if you go from f8 to 5.6, 4, 2.8, 2, you need to subtract 4 stops off both flashes, and I would get exactly the same result just using it at f2. And so I got in very close, focused on his eyes, and I got this beautiful portrait of, you know, just him sort of basically staring down the barrel of the lens and still having that beautiful light on him. The final thing that I did was to switch off that rim light and get a shot without that as well at f2. Now, the great thing about these Godox flashes is you can control them all from the trigger, and so with a push of a button I was able to switch that off and just keep shooting without him really even noticing that anything had changed, and so that makes it very easy. The one other thing you might notice about these portraits is there's sort of a low contrast, a bit of a haze in the air, and that is just the fact that they do constantly have an open fire burning in these houses, so there's always a little bit of smoke in the air, and you know, whether you want it or not, you're going to get a slightly reduced contrast look in these houses. Now, looking back at my EXIF data now, this whole process took a total of 9 minutes. So that's basically all 4 of these setups in 9 minutes. And that was working through a translator who, by the way, actually has a YouTube channel of his own. So I'll link that up here and down here as well. You can go check it out. Basically, he films these little shorts of what it's like to live in his communities, what it's like to be in these villages now. So they're beautiful little shorts, just some music over the top showing you how life goes out there. For this second image, I wanted to talk a little bit about balancing flash with available light. And so on this day, I wasn't shooting inside a dark house. I was actually shooting outside on a reasonably overcast day. And so everything was fairly evenly lit, but the sun was still high in the sky, and so it was coming down from the top and illuminating the tops of the heads a little bit more, and also, you know, giving me some darker eye sockets as well. So I did want to avoid that by using flash, and also bring that, you know, that style, that drama that I have in my other portraits to this one as well. So my process here was a little bit different from the previous one in that I didn't want to have a super dramatic shot where I blacked out all of the ambient light. So what I did first was to set my ambient exposure to allow this person's face to be visible, to allow the background to be visible, and just have it a little bit underexposed. So if you were to shoot this shot without flash, you'd end up with a shot that was about 2 stops underexposed, and it would all just look a little bit dark. And then from there I could actually add flash on top of that, so keeping my camera settings the same and just adding in my own light. However, I still wanted that background to go completely black, and so I would still need to use that sheet of black that I used in the previous portrait to basically black out the things that were behind her, which was, you know, the clutter around the entrance to her home and the other people who were standing by sort of watching us. Even this, though, has a couple of little things that I had to do to make sure it would stay black. So, as I said, it was an overcast day, which means everything is evenly lit. Now, underexposing something by 2 stops doesn't make it go completely black, and especially when we have the, you know, the amount of dynamic range that we have with the GFX, I wanted that to go really, really dark. So I had my driver who was with us actually holding that up behind this lady, and I had him step back under the awnings of her house, because basically, despite the fact that it was a cloudy day, you go under those awnings and you lose another 2 stops of light. So I was able to send that really, really dark and not have to worry about, you know, maybe my flash hitting it and, you know, lighting up the curves in the fabric if the wind blew or something like that. I could ensure that it would go really, really dark. The final step, as I said, was to bring in the flash and get my exposure. Now, unlike the first image where I was working at the sync speed of the GFX, I would have to work in high-speed sync outdoors, because f2 was going to give me, you know, 1,000th of a second, a 2,000th of a second, and so the regular sync speed was exceeded. Now, thankfully, the Godox triggers are actually able to communicate with the Fujifilm body, and they know that already, so they kick straight into high-speed sync mode, and I didn't have to worry about that, but I did have to do a couple of tests just to make sure, you know, I was getting the correct exposure. Over time, using the Godox flashes, I'm getting pretty good at, you know, being able to nail things under the sync speed, but once you get above that, it does take a couple of tests to get it right. And so once I had those, I was able to bring in my subject and start working with her. Now, in this case, we were actually working through 3 languages. So I was speaking to my guide and translator in English. He was translating to Hindi, which was then going to their local language to her. And so it took a little while to go back and forth, and it does make the photography a little bit more difficult. So I kept it very, very simple. I made about 20 images, tried to keep her attention with all the other people around watching, and once I had what I needed, I stopped. I didn't want to push it any further than that. So I hope that this quick look at how I shoot the portraits for my Tattoos of Asia project has been helpful for you. If you want to go into a little bit more detail about how I work with flash and learn a few other techniques, I do have a whole book on this process available over at fujilove.com, and so I'll link to that in the description below. If you've enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, please feel free to leave any questions about this process or the project in general below, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Cheers!